Okay, so our hope would be to get through at least indicator 1 before the break, but we'll see how we do, right? All right, so our order, as I mentioned, was very intentional, not just for getting the hard stuff out of the way, but also to help highlight the connections across indicators. And I mentioned this when we were looking particularly at those high school math rates, right? That it's a big part of the story, isn't it, when we look at math proficiency rates in reading and in math, and then we go where we're headed right now, which is graduation. So I would ask you to kind of keep that in mind, right, when we think about not only the factors at play, but our approach to target setting and how they are interrelated. So graduation, talk about a loaded indicator, right? I know we've talked about graduation with this group before. Graduation is an evolving path in Ohio, right? Largely due to changing graduation requirements over really the last 5 years. And of course, we know the class of 23, again, when we have our newest graduation requirements will take effect beginning with the class of 23. But we know we've also had a lot of concerns, right, around all students being able to meet more rigorous graduation requirements, not just students with disabilities. That led to protests, right, outside of the State House, lots of statewide concern. That led to legislation, right, that gave us alternate pathways, additional pathways for all students, beginning with the class of 2018. All of that affects our data, right, and it's part of the story that we have to consider. So with graduation, there's really no cutting corners on this one. This is one where we have to, and I know this group can do it because you've already done it with indicator 3, we have to consider all of the variables at play. So I've started with a few of them. The next one we'll spend probably the most time on because it's most impactful for this indicator. At the same time that all of that was swirling in Ohio, right, and continues to swirl in terms of changing graduation requirements, we also have a implementation of a new definition at the federal level, not just for IDEA, but also with the Every Student Succeeds Act, in terms of how a regular high school diploma is defined. So the federal government determined and thus requires states to align with a definition of regular high school diploma that says that students, particularly students with disabilities, who graduate by requirements that are not available to all students cannot be counted as receiving a regular high school diploma, even if they're granted one in their state. So for federal reporting, we have to count all students with disabilities who graduate by modified requirements as not receiving a regular high school diploma. We have to count them as receiving a certificate. And that affects our data a lot, as we'll see. We know in Ohio that students with disabilities who take alternate assessments, who are excused from passing their end of course exams, or who graduate by meeting their IEP goals, cannot be considered as having received a regular high school diploma. So that is how indicator 1 really will be calculated going forward. So what we're going to see are much lower graduation rates than we're used to seeing. And it's tough, right? Because you all bring, not just a parent and family perspective, certainly, but the local level perspective and the idea of, but these kids are getting diplomas, right? They're graduating, they're going on to what's next for them in their journey. And they are, but they're doing so through modified requirements at really, as you'll see, a really high rate. And that's really the story here. There will always be, right, a subset of students with disabilities for whom it is appropriate for them to graduate by modified requirements. But we have too many of them doing so in Ohio, particularly compared to the rest of the nation. And that definitely, impacts, right, our indicator 1 graduation rates. So the first thing to note, as if everything I covered isn't enough, right? I know it's more than enough. But the first thing to note about the actual calculation, when we get into that, is we are changing gears. This is another area where federal requirements to the indicators mean that we're no longer aligned to our report card data. So indicator 1 used to, right up until now this year, align to what we know as the 4-year cohort graduation rate, right, that we see on our report card. Of all the students who started high school 4 years ago, right, how many of them have graduated within 4 years? That's the graduation rate that we're all used to. But now we can no longer align to that. Now we have to do what's called an exiting rate. So it looks at, of all the students with disabilities who exited high school this year, right, in the reporting year, how many of them graduated by meeting that definition of regular high school diploma? So going down into our data notes, this is a place where it's important to spend a little bit of time. Some of these things I have touched on, but I just want to really kind of bring this point home. The loss, what we lose, right, by not being able to align to our report card data is more than just, well, we have to do it a different way, right? We lose the ability to align to those business rules, to all of the infrastructure, right, that we have in Ohio around access to the data, awareness and understanding of the data because of all of the years of, and the visibility, frankly, right, of the report card. We lose that, and we lose the ability to directly compare, graduation rates for students with disabilities to all students, right, or to students without disabilities. Those are, again, concerns that we shared and other states shared when these changes were proposed as part of our public comment opportunity. But nonetheless, the goal at the U.S. Department of Education was consistency in data sources. Their challenge when they looked across states was too much, inconsistency in terms of graduation calculations, so that it wasn't an apples to apples comparison across states. And though we understand that, right, the trade-off is a big one. So I mention that because it does require a lot of kind of shifting gears, right, in our thinking when we talk about graduation rates in this way. So as I mentioned, those primary pathways by which our students tend to graduate by modified requirements in Ohio, those students with disabilities are included in the denominator for this calculation, but we can't count them in the numerator. We have to count them in the certificate bucket, even though we don't have a certificate. In Ohio, we have a diploma, a standard diploma, but nonetheless, that's how we have to count them for the reasons I talked about. I mentioned number 3, this challenge will continue, right? Talk about apples to apples comparisons or a lack thereof. When graduation requirements continue to change, it makes looking at our data over time very difficult, right? Because they're not apples to apples comparisons, but yet, that is sort of our reality. So we'll look at that when we look at our data over time. And this is where you'll see this theme across indicators. I know many stakeholders who are engaging in this process often appreciate being able to think about our data in terms of how are we performing relative to other states. Where we've been able to access that in this very ambitious timeline, we've worked to do that for you. And so I do want to spend some time there. Next, we're able to look at where we stand relative to other states in graduation because it is one of the measures used for our annual state special education determination, right? That's required by IDEA. Our 2021 determination is needs assistance for the second consecutive year. We received needs assistance because we earned 0 points for graduation and for dropout, as we'll look at next. A score of 0 means that we are in the lowest performing group of states on those measures. And to show you exactly how low that is, I know you don't have this on your fact sheet. We got access to the data and added it after your drafts were sent out. I hope everyone can see this, but I will do my best to zoom in here briefly and do my best to just talk through it. You don't really have to be able to read all the states along the bottom to know that when we look at graduation with a regular high school diploma for students with disabilities, for the class of 2019, right, so pre-pandemic, Ohio is second only to Mississippi as the lowest performing states in the nation on this measure. at 48%, right? So we're not even at a 50% graduation rate when we think about not being able to count, those students with disabilities who are graduating by modified requirements, right? Not being able to count them anymore in our numerator. So it's really important to acknowledge that, because this has affected us every year that it has been part of our state determinations. We've never gotten anything other than a 0 on graduation rate. It makes it real hard to get a rating of meets requirements. We've done it, right? We've had high performance in other areas, and we've been able to get meets requirements. But this year, graduation and dropout definitely are a hit, for us. So we will continue to struggle as a state in terms of the accountability impact and lots of other impacts, right? The larger question is, what impact does this have on our students with disabilities in terms of, are they really prepared for what comes next, right? If we have a culture of excusal in our state, how does that affect their ability to jump into the workforce or to jump into higher ed and to be successful? That's really what we're grappling with here when we think about our high rate of excusal in Ohio. So now that we have our data relative to other states in mind, let's take a look at our data over the last 4 years. So this is where those changing graduation requirements definitely come into play. I'm just going to zoom out just a tad so we can see a little bit more on the screen. So we have what would look like certainly a lot of cause for celebration when we went from a 31%, which was unfortunately much more typical of our data in this way, before the class of 2018, when we went up to a 50%. It would certainly not be surprising to look at that without any other information and say that is cause for celebration. Paulo, right, our recently departed state superintendent, did exactly that, right? But shouldn't we be celebrating that we went to a 50%? I'm all for celebration, I assure you. But we definitely want to acknowledge that it isn't an apples to apples comparison, right? We had that increase largely because of those additional pathways that the legislature passed, starting with the class of 2018. All students could graduate now by a combination of things like attendance, right, and GPA, and those types of additional approaches. Because those additional pathways were available to all students, we were able to count, right, a lot more students with disabilities in the numerator because they did graduate by requirements that were available to all students. They were just less rigorous, right, for all students, beginning with the class of 2018. So that explains our jump from 31% to 50%, and then we've hovered there, and then we did the class of 2020. Dana, I'm going to guess that you're thinking there's those course grade substitutions playing out. You're probably right if that is what you're thinking, that we saw another jump, right, beginning with the class of 2020, up from 48% to 58%. And so there's, certainly other pandemic implications, at play that make this really difficult to compare our data even from one year to the next, right, let alone over multiple years. So we do have a lot of programmatic considerations, to kind of offset this reality, right? We are doing a lot of work around graduation and post dropout and post-school outcomes, led by Amy Szymanski in our office and lots of others. And I know you all have heard from her and worked with her. And certainly, each child means each child, right? A core focus of that strategic plan is right in this area. And then lots of legislation to consider. In the interest of time, I need to get us down, of course, to our target options. So with all of those swirling variables in mind, you might be thinking, you said indicator 1 was easier than indicator 3. I probably did. I should have said it's shorter than indicator 3. That's probably more realistic. It is also complicated because of all of these factors around graduation. So looking at, our baseline, right, which is a 58.53% for the class of 2020. That's going to be our starting place. So we have same approach, right, as before. Option A could be considered less rigorous. Option B, as we'll see, would be considered more rigorous. So you can see that this is where we get to look at actual targets, right? Rather than the guessing of like, well, whatever we are at, plus 0.2 or 0.5, we get to look at actual targets. So I think that that is a welcome transition from indicator 3. And so not only do we get to look at actual targets, right, as a starting place, you can see, that we're proposing to, again, more conservative, right, stay at our new baseline for the current year in recognition of the pandemic, and then begin to show steady improvement of a 0.5% increase each year thereafter, roughly. So getting from 50 to 59, and then 59.5, and then 60, and then ending at 60.5 in the last year. So the idea here, right, the rationale is that if we have potentially inflated graduation rates due to those changing graduation requirements, as we've talked about, it might account for the fact that our new reality that would begin, I guess, with the class of 23, right, when our new requirements will take effect, what will essentially be a new baseline again, right, if that is quite a bit lower, then we might need to be right back here setting new targets, right? But so taking a more conservative approach may make sense, and it does reflect small incremental increases to allow time for, I would say, there, as described, right, in the programmatic considerations, there's a lot of optimism around, eventual, right, optimism around the new graduation requirements. That when, our districts across the state are able to get everything ready and have enough support, right, to implement those in full, they do provide, more and different opportunities, ways for students with disabilities in particular to show what they know, right, in different ways, but still meet standard graduation requirements, more versatility and options. So an optimistic lens, right, would suggest that after we had some time to implement those, that we could start to show improvement around graduation. So another new feature to consider now, and this will apply to every other indicator going forward, because we have actual targets in front of you now instead of a growth approach that was required for indicator 3, we want to give the lens of like how many kids are we talking about, right? How many students are we talking about? Because it becomes, I know it feels very arbitrary, right? To say, well, we want to get to a 60.5%. That sounds pretty good, right? What does that actually mean, right? So what that means is it would require 407 more students with disabilities statewide to graduate by standard requirements, right? Compared to where we are now. So to get from where we are now to where we want to be in option A in 25-26, 407 more students statewide to graduate by standard requirements. Okay, and then with that in our minds, let's go then to option B for comparison. Much like we saw with indicator 3, option B would start showing growth right away this school year, and you can see much larger increments of growth, right? Getting us up to 60% starting this school year, then 62, 64, 66, and so on, up to a 70%, right, graduation rate in the final year. So the rationale here is that getting to a 70% would move us from that lowest performing group of states that we've been in since the beginning of state determinations to the middle performing group of states, which I know aiming for mediocrity might not sound like a rigorous approach, and yet given our starting place, getting to a 70% would be a place we've never achieved since the beginning of that measure. The idea is, that certainly high expectations. Of course, we know all of the structures and supports that need to go right along with those high expectations to make them possible. So for comparison, another reason to add in the number of students, right? It helps us see how much more rigorous, right, is option B compared to option A. So we looked at option A, right? That final year target would require 407 more students to graduate by standard requirements. In comparison, getting to a 70% would require 2,364 more students with disabilities statewide to graduate by standard requirement.